Hello, and welcome to Istanbul Policy Center's new podcast series, NATO and Türkiye, a weekly podcast on all things NATO and Türkiye in the lead up to the Alliance's Ankara summit taking place in July. I'm Megan Gisclon, managing editor and researcher at Istanbul Policy Center, and today I have Ambassador Matthew Bryza with me to discuss NATO, Türkiye, and the United States. Ambassador Matthew Bryza is a retired U.S. diplomat with over 20 years of experience in the U.S. government. During his time in government, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Azerbaijan, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and the National Security Council staff at the White House, among other postings. He previously served as the director of the International Center for Defense and Security at Tallinn, Estonia. Today, he is the managing director of Strive Consulting in Istanbul, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Turkey program, and a board member of the Jamestown Foundation. Thank you for being with us today, Ambassador Bryza.
Thanks, Megan. It's both an honor and a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all ours.
Ah,
So, great. Let's hop into the first
sure.
question then.
Yeah.
So first, I'd like to start out discussing your time working with the State Department at the end of the
Mhm.
Cold War. Could you tell us about your time in the state from the early 1990s until the early 2000s, how Washington viewed the developments in NATO during this period, and sort of by developments, I mean kind of enlargement, NATO partnerships, relations with Moscow, since this is a formative period for all of these developments within NATO?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I joined the U.S. Foreign Service at an unbelievably exciting time in terms of the Cold War and all the relationships you just mentioned. So I joined the Foreign Service in August of 1988, and my first assignment began in the summer of 1989 in Poland, which was my great dream. I'm a Polish American from Chicago, but in addition to that, I mean, that was the period when there was such enormous, epochal change taking place in Poland, pretty much leading the whole Soviet bloc at the time. Um, and so, thanks to the Solidarity movement. So I arrived in Poland on the last day of July in 1989. So my first day of work was the first day of free market in Poland, because at
Mhm.
that time, the Solidarity opposition movement and the communist government had just completed a historic round of negotiations that led to democratic elections for
Mhm.
parliament, which the Solidarity movement overwhelmingly won. And so this was the very beginning of all of the reforms in the former Soviet bloc. I mean, the deep reforms
Mhm.
that were also made possible by, of course, former Soviet Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, which meant openness, which meant
Mhm.
speaking the truth more, and perestroika, which meant restructuring not only the internal functionings of the Soviet Union, but also the Soviet Union's relations with us in the West. So my first day on the job was the first day of free market pricing. So the first day of the free market, except for some food items. The communist government was still in control of the executive of Poland. But then during the course of the next few months, that changed. Solidarity came in and took over the government as the communists basically stepped back. And by November, so from July till November, this was all happening. In November, I found myself in Berlin the very day that the Berlin Wall, quote unquote, fell. And when yeah, when the communist East German government allowed East Germans to travel through the Berlin Wall to freedom. Um, and I was there simply by chance. I was just picking up a friend of mine at the airport.
Mhm.
And so I then spent that weekend with some great friends from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I went to graduate school, one of which is Ambassador Mike Hammer, who's currently our ambassador to Cuba of the United States.
Mhm.
Um, and we just experienced that whole amazing, what became a celebration of freedom and
Mhm.
opening. So I began my career at a moment of intense and positive change, and I was thrilled to observe and even sort of play a part in some of these historical developments, because through an accident of history, the solidarity leader that I got to know in Western Poland became the leader of Poland's brand new intelligence services on the same week that I moved from a consulate in Western Poland in Poznań to Warsaw, to the embassy. And so I was able to really to see and maybe not affect, but see how the national security apparatus of Poland was transforming from pro-Soviet or pro-Russian and communist to pro-US and pro-NATO. And while I was in the embassy, the Warsaw Pact dissolved. Um, Poland then became our main partner, Democratic Poland, in Iraq, as the then administration of George H.W. Bush was gearing up for that Gulf War. Um, and just one thing that really struck me was then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney visited
Mhm.
Poland during this period. And I was his control officer for his meeting with Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa in Gdańsk. And during that meeting, Lech Wałęsa asked whether it could be conceivable that Poland could one day buy U.S. F-16 fighter jets.
Mhm.
And Secretary Cheney was, he was polite and kind, and he kind of avoided the answer. But in the bus on the way to the airport, he said, "Oh my gosh, it seems crazy that he could ask that. I mean, they're still part of the Warsaw Pact." And within 3 months or so, the Warsaw Pact was gone.
Mhm.
And of course, Poland has become one of the most important cornerstones of NATO. Of course, it has F-16
Mhm.
fighter jets. And NATO then enlarged, as we know, to bring in Poland and lots of other countries. And it went from 16 nations to whatever, 23 now, and more coming down the road. Um, the relationship or the attitude toward Moscow was positive and warm, and from my perspective, encouraging the reforms then that not only Gorbachev but then Boris Yeltsin, as
Mhm.
president of Russia, was pursuing. And I served in the Office of Russian Affairs in the State Department during
Mhm.
the mid '90s, early '90s. And we really thought we were building a partnership with Russia. We really thought we were supporting the reforms, supporting its economy, and recognizing that if Russia's economy didn't succeed, if it didn't flourish,
Mhm.
there would be a backlash. And we didn't foresee Vladimir Putin coming into power, but we realized sort of proto-Soviet or great Russian nationalism could take over and kill the reforms and lead to confrontation with Russia. But our goal, even in the beginning of President George W. Bush's administration, where, as you kindly noted, I served in his White House for 4 years, we were trying to build a strategic partnership with Russia. But the
Mhm.
Russians never believed it. And I was giving a presentation in a bilateral U.S.-Russian National Security Commission we had that was chaired by our then National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley. And my job was to explain what the U.S.'s policy goals were in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And I just laid it out, the truth openly. And I said, we seek to promote political and market economic reforms of these countries uh, because we know that will lead to their long-term stability and allow us to build a strong security relationship with both them and with you, Moscow. And we seek to promote investments, especially in the energy sector and oil and gas,
Mhm.
and to make sure that the resources that are going to be produced in the Caspian Sea can make it to global markets free of monopoly power, like your Russian pipelines. You want to monopolize them. We don't want monopolization. And free from geographic choke points like the Turkish Straits. And the Deputy National Security Advisor of Russia looked at me after I gave that presentation, aghast, and he said, "You expect us to believe that? We know that's a lie. You're trying to control these countries at Russia's expense," which was absolutely untrue.
Mhm.
So one last point, the key element of our entire approach to the South Caucasus at that time was Turkey. And Turkey's ambitions, along with those of Azerbaijan and Georgia, to develop a network of oil and gas pipelines that would, again, as I just said, deliver the Caspian oil and gas, and
Mhm.
in the beginning, Azerbaijani, though we hoped
Mhm.
Kazakhstani oil and gas could be involved as well, but to deliver them to into Turkey,
Mhm.
the natural gas, and then the oil as well, and then have it be exported outside of the Turkish Straits through the Mediterranean Turkish port of Ceyhan. That all succeeded. The Russians didn't like it. Their deputy foreign ministers admitted to me in private repeatedly that they wanted to maintain their monopoly on exports
Mhm.
of post-Soviet space oil and gas because they knew that was the most powerful card, geopolitical card they had to play. And we just disagreed. And in partnership, very, very close partnership with Turkey, a strategic partnership, in fact. We were able to persuade the international oil and gas companies and the countries along the pipeline routes to work together and to build pipelines that made commercial sense. These projects were not subsidized by any government.
Hmm.
There were no U.S. companies at the end that were directly involved. So the projects had to make financial sense for not just for the countries, but for the companies that were the investors. And that was successful. So at that point, so this is in the early 2000s. In fact, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline began operating in 2006. The U.S.-Turkish relationship was one of strategic partnership. That all, though, was being put under great stress by the U.S. decision to invade Iraq in
Hmm.
2003, and then Turkey's decision not to say yes to the U.S.'s request to be able to conduct that operation, in part via Turkey's territory.
Hmm. Okay, great. So you kind of addressed the U.S.-Turkish relationship in this time, and you brought up the war in Iraq. Of course, there were some bilateral tensions, but at the same time, the U.S. and Turkey were cooperating through NATO, a very strong strategic partnership. What other avenues of cooperation did the U.S. and Turkey pursue outside of energy, and sort of how did their NATO partnership sort of, let's say, override the sort of bilateral disagreements at this time?
It didn't. So
Hmm.
the relationship became really bad between the
Hmm.
U.S. and Turkey, um, beginning with the March 1st, 2003 decision by the Turkish Grand National Assembly
Hmm.
to say no to the U.S. request.
Okay.
Um, Eventually, Turkey flipped and said yes, but by that
Hmm.
time, the U.S. had already adjusted its war plan to avoid
Hmm.
Turkey entirely. And Ankara took that, I think, as a gesture of bad faith.
Hmm.
Whereas we tried to explain that no, you said no.
Hmm.
All we have to do is change the plan. It'll be more expensive for us,
Hmm.
but we're still going to succeed. And I think that, well, the United States still did end up extending a grant of about $1 billion to Turkey to try to
Hmm.
help it to shield it against what we knew were going to be negative economic consequences of the war. But at that time, I could see as Turkey was trying to figure out whether or not it would say yes, and then said no. As I explained to my colleagues in Ankara and the fantastic Turkish ambassador at the time, Faruk Lolu, in Washington, I can't get out of my head this vision of uh, the U.S.-Turkish relationship like a beautiful airplane that's been flying high, safe, bringing
Hmm.
security. And then now, with this difference of view over the Iraq War, it's on fire. The plane is on fire. Its engines have stopped working. It's
Hmm.
gliding, but inevitably it is going to crash. And
Hmm.
it did. So Turkey went from had it said yes on March 1st,
Hmm.
2003, it would have been a top tier ally, like at the level of the United Kingdom.
Hmm.
But then when it crashed, when the relationship crashed, it was seen no longer as a partner with whom to manage problems, but rather as a problem in itself that needed to be managed. And
Hmm.
that view only got worse over the ensuing years,
Hmm.
and really grew bad, of course, after the coup attempt. Thank God it failed.
Hmm.
And then when Turkey decided to buy S-400 Russian air defense missiles,
Hmm.
after the United States and Turkey couldn't agree on terms for Turkey to buy a U.S. Patriot systems, that then led to, as we know, a whole new drop in U.S.-Turkish relations and the imposition of sanctions by Washington on Turkey under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. So Turkey
Hmm.
went from being a strategic partner to an adversary, according to the U.S.
Hmm.
Congress. Uh, and then Turkey, of course, being expelled from the F-35 program, even after it spent billions of dollars for procurement of its first aircraft. But throughout this period, I, of course, would consult my colleagues and friends that were working at NATO and the U.S.
Hmm.
mission there. And they always said throughout this period, despite how terrible the tensions got between the U.S. and Turkey, Turkey remained a great NATO ally, reliable, helpful. We have seen that attitude with regard to Ukraine, where Turkey, okay, it hasn't joined the U.S. sanctions or EU sanctions on Russia, and it's maintained open communications with President Putin. But it's done so in a way that has allowed Turkey to position itself as a
Hmm.
valuable mediator. And at the same time, Turkey has been absolutely consistent in condemning the violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity by Russia,
Hmm.
and so
Yeah.
condemning Russia's invasion and occupation
Hmm.
of Crimea and part of Donbass, and military technical cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine has strengthened,
Hmm.
and so that's, I think, people, officials at NATO and in NATO member states uh, deeply appreciate this important
Hmm.
contribution Turkey has made to NATO's shared interests in
Hmm.
helping Ukraine defend itself,
Hmm.
but also maintaining a channel of strategic communication with both President Putin and President Zelensky in Ukraine.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, no, your analogy of sort of the slow-moving airplane fizzling out. I'm thinking more of a blimp, so something that moves
Yeah.
a little bit slower, maybe since we kind of went from the Iraq War to sort of 2020s in terms of Turkey's relationship within NATO. Yes, I mean during this period of very tense U.S.-Turkey relations between, well, I mean, of course, I'm not talking even about the Iraq War, but just sort of even more recently, kind of the two after the failed coup attempt in Turkey, there was a lot of discussion, oh, is Turkey is, sort of moving towards Russia? Is it moving toward away from NATO? And how at least Secretary General at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, sort of, would come out with consistent NATO messaging. Oh no, Turkey is an important ally,
Yep.
and messaging all throughout NATO institutions. Turkey's doing this, doing that. So yeah, I mean, we kind of have two different looks there. The U.S.-Turkish bilateral relation, sort of separate from Turkey's relations in NATO and Turkey's relations with the U.S. and NATO too. Then.
Yeah, that's true. Well, there are a lot of people in Washington who
Hmm.
don't like or are paid not to like Turkey, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of lobbying.
There's a lot
There's
of different interest in Washington, we can say very
there is.
diplomatically there.
No,
So,
absolutely. I mean, one of them, if you take the Armenian diaspora, there's half of it that is very constructive and
hmm.
works really well with the U.S. government, and half of it, or whatever percentage, that
Hmm.
doesn't,
Sure.
and that tries
Hmm.
to block any improvement in U.S. Turkish or U.S. Azerbaijani relations that resulted in
Hmm.
my nomination as ambassador to Azerbaijan being blocked.
Hmm.
And the senator who was leading that charge, of course, Robert Menendez, will probably spend the rest of his life in prison, not because of anything having to do with me, but because of his convictions of corruption. Um, and so, um, and many think tanks and journalists in Washington came to believe, yes, as I said, that Turkey is a problem to be managed, that it's not a democratic country, that elections
Hmm.
aren't real, that it's not a reliable NATO member. And as you said, Megan, that Turkey is tilting toward Russia rather than towards NATO. Those things are not true.
Hmm.
Um, Elections matter in Turkey. This is not an authoritarian
Yeah.
state. Granted, we can look into all the problems with freedom of expression and journalists or political
Hmm.
opponents being imprisoned. You can debate that. Um, and I already talked about how Turkey hasn't joined sanctions against Russia, but you know Turkey, under the Ottoman Empire, fought more wars against the Russian Empire
Hmm.
than against any other country. And it did not fare well in those wars. I mean, it really
Hmm.
didn't win any of them, maybe 13 wars over the centuries.
Hmm.
And so the Turkish national security establishment has an approach toward Russia, in my experience, that does not want to antagonize Russia
Hmm.
if that can be avoided, but will definitely stand up for Turkish national interests, and now in this post-Cold War period, NATO's interests.
Hmm.
So Turkey is always balancing, just like the policy approach to Ukraine that I already described. Now, having said that, Turkey did join the Astana process with Russia and Iran for trying to manage Syria,
Hmm.
and that only inflamed these negative Turkish impressions
Yes,
in Washington and New
definitely.
York and elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that was problematic. On the other hand, I mean, Turkey has been crucial inside NATO
Hmm.
to building a consensus and to being able to operate efficiently in deterring Russia. And I should also note that Turkey and Israel used to have a strategic partnership, by the way, together
Hmm.
with the United States, and a lot of that was centered on those pipelines that I was mentioning before.
Hmm.
That, of course, is different now, given what Israel's been
Hmm.
doing inside Gaza. But in any case, uh, Turkey, inside its foreign policy establishment, there is a group, a traditional group called the Eurasia School,
Hmm.
of even senior military officials, generals, admirals, that believe that Turkey's natural place in the world is in the East, is in
Hmm.
Asia, where the Turkic tribes came from, right? They came from
Hmm.
the Altai region of present-day Russian Federation. And so its natural way to exist is together with other Turkic states. We have the
Hmm.
Organization of Turkish States, and that Turkey really doesn't isn't naturally a European country and shouldn't base its national security on being a member of Europe. I think that at the end of the day, Europe would be wise to embrace Turkey, as NATO has, so the European Union would be. But that debate's going to go on for a long time. And as long as the Greeks, Cypriots, and Greeks are members of the European Union, which they will be, they will make it difficult, I think, for Turkey to join the European Union.
Yeah, sure. So, and I mean, also while you were at the State Department, of course, I'm sure you were dealing with Turkey, not only sort of in sort of the pipeline energy context, but also Turkey's European Union aspirations.
Yeah,
Hmm.
everything was in my portfolio,
Hmm.
including U.S. strong U.S. support for Turkey's EU membership. And the
Hmm.
reason why we were so supportive was because we realized that the process of complying with EU regulations or fulfilling the
Hmm.
chapters under the acquis communautaire, to be technical, would transform Turkey in a way that would make it a stronger and more effective ally of the United States,
Hmm.
and a better servant of its own people and its own voters. So yes, we were strong supporters of
Hmm.
Turkey's EU membership. I was also, I mean, I served as the de facto U.S. mediator of the Cyprus conflict.
Hmm.
Uh, and, I think we irritated our European EU member state allies because they
Hmm.
said, thank you for your opinion. We understand the positive impact that, a reforming Turkey will have on the
Hmm.
entire world, but you're not an EU member state, so you're not going to have an impact on this
Sure.
debate.
So there's no vote for the United or from the
No,
United States within the EU. So for
exactly.
moving on, how would you describe the U.S.-Turkish relationship today? There's been a lot of talk about, this sort of reinvigoration of relations under the second Trump administration. How do you see this in sort of terms of defense cooperation that might affect Turkey and the U.S.'s position and cooperation within NATO?
The relations are much better, and they were better under President Trump one as well than they were
Hmm.
under President Obama or President Biden subsequently. During his election campaign in
Hmm.
November, I think, of 2019, you'll recall that President Biden said he would like to see a change in the government of Turkey. He said, of course, by democratic means, but he
Hmm.
he he said that
Yeah, yeah.
President Erdogan should no longer be the head the leader of Turkey. Erdogan and Trump already had a positive personal relationship, and President Trump only reluctantly imposed sanctions under the CAATSA that I mentioned before on
Hmm.
on Turkey when his hand was basically forced by the U.S. Congress. By the way, I'm not a member of
Hmm.
any political party. I'm not a supporter of President Trump. I'm just calling it like
Sure.
I saw it.
Hmm.
When President Biden came to power, or came into office, it was almost like an arithmetic equation that the U.S. relationship with Turkey would worsen because the personal bond between Erdogan and Trump was no longer relevant because you had Trump out of office and Biden in
Hmm.
office. Um, Antony Blinken, as Secretary of State, very much appreciated the value of Turkey, and Ukraine was an area where the U.S. and Turkey started working well together.
Hmm.
But when Turkey intervened to support Azerbaijan in the Second
Hmm.
Karabakh War, that created a lot of tension with Washington, and then the tension grew even worse when, in September of 2023, Azerbaijan launched a final military operation to banish the Armenian troops that had entered Azerbaijani territory even
Hmm.
after the Second Karabakh War had ended, and also to arrest the leaders of really which was a separatist, illegal ethnic Armenian regime on Azerbaijani territory in Karabakh. The use of force by Azerbaijan, even though it was a highly limited operation, in which there was not a single civilian casualty of any sort, not even an injury, nevertheless created tension with the Biden administration, who had advised Azerbaijan not to use military force for domestic U.S. political reasons. So the return of President Trump is sort of like the return of an old friend from
Hmm.
President Erdogan's perspective. President Trump himself doesn't have really a strategic vision. I think at all.
Mm-hmm.
He's so transactional. He doesn't have a strategy, therefore,
Mm-hmm.
for really anywhere. He's got a national strategy, national security strategy, which I highly recommend reading. Turkey doesn't fit into that at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's not mentioned. But he has very capable people, including Ambassador Barrack, who do have a strategic vision. And then the U.S., bureaucratic system and the State
Mm-hmm.
Department and the U.S. Pentagon, the Department of Defense or Department of War, they do have strategic concepts where
Mm-hmm.
Turkey is really in the middle. And when we see what a crucial role Turkey has played in the successful transformation of Syria, that has really proven Turkey's strategic value for these sorts of people that are senior in the Trump administration, even if the president himself doesn't really have a strategic vision involving Turkey in the
Mm-hmm.
region. And we saw this in play when President Trump was visiting Saudi Arabia. And during his
Mm-hmm.
meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, President Erdogan dialed into that meeting
Mm-hmm.
by phone or via video and persuaded President Trump to lift sanctions on Syria so that the new al-Shara government would have a chance to survive after the ouster of Assad. So in Syria, Turkey is absolutely crucial to stabilizing that country and giving it a chance to transform and flourish and prosper. So President Trump does very much appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the military and defense relationship you mentioned, yeah, I think U.S. military leadership very much appreciates the prowess of Turkey's
Mm-hmm.
defense industries, which have grown amazingly in response to largely in response to embargoes
Mm-hmm.
earlier by the United States, more recently by the European Union or the European members of NATO. And Turkey now produces world class in terms of quality defense technologies
Mm-hmm.
and at a cost competitive rate or economically competitive prices. And so cost effective prices. And so there are, yes, a lot of NATO member states and the United States that are acquiring Turkish defense technologies. And we saw just in the last few days, right? Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, is in Berlin
Mm-hmm.
to resurrect the Turkey-Berlin strategic dialogue, which hadn't convened since 2012. And Defense Minister Pistorius, when he explained and announced the rotation of a German Patriot air defense battery into Turkey to replace the departing U.S. one, he
Mm-hmm.
made this point that Turkey is a crucial NATO partner on defense, and that Turkey's defense technologies are highly attractive in terms of quality and price to the NATO alliance.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that I think is the sort of resounding feedback Turkey keeps getting is, quality price ratio is very high. So
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think Turkey's defense sector has grown 10 times over. I don't want
yeah.
to no one quote me on that, but I think 10 times over in the past few years. So this is really remarkable growth. Okay, so kind of going ahead to this summer, President Trump in The Hague, President Trump asked the allies to agree to 5% of defense spending target. And what do you think the United States wants to see come out of this summit in Ankara?
Yeah, of course, the U.S. wants to see
Mhm.
implementation across the
Okay.
alliance of that 5%
Hmm.
of GDP spending target. Some NATO member states are doing it. Turkey is now doing
Hmm.
it. Poland is doing it. Estonia.
Hmm.
So frontline countries that share
Hmm.
a border with Russia. I mean, you could argue Turkey does share a border with Russia, sort of
Sure.
across the Black Sea, right?
Definitely.
They're meeting those targets. So the target it's the 5% is comprised of 3.5% of actual straightforward military spending,
Hmm.
and then the other 1.5% is dual use things
Sure.
like upgrading highway infrastructure and bridges and other dual use capabilities. So seeing the European members of NATO and Canada achieve those spending targets, that's definitely a priority
Hmm.
I think for the United States going into the NATO summit. But it's more though than just the spending targets. It's
Hmm.
that NATO is using that spending to acquire the capabilities that are needed, right, to deter Russia from attacking NATO territory. And that the procurement and the development of these defensive systems, country by country, actually is more integrated than has been the case. And
Hmm.
the dream would be to have sort of integrated procurement, but the nationalism and
Hmm.
national champions in NATO member states remain strong, and so each NATO country wants to strengthen their own defense sectors,
Hmm.
and so it's difficult to rationalize the procurement
Hmm.
strategies. But the U.S. would like to see more rationalization of the procurement.
Hmm.
Um, we see, by the way, the Trump administration in general wants to see NATO's European members taking on more and more responsibility, more and more
Hmm.
burden sharing, especially for deterring Russia from attacking NATO territory, and for Russia's being defeated in Ukraine. Because from President Trump's perspective, Ukraine is in Europe.
Hmm.
Ukraine is next door to the European member states of NATO. They're the ones that have the greatest immediate need to deter Russia. So they should take on the lion's share of the responsibility rather than the United States, which is
Hmm.
separated from Europe by an ocean. I mean, that's President Trump's perspective. I don't share it entirely. Part of it
Hmm.
does make sense. There should be much more burden sharing. It would be great if all the NATO alliance did what Turkey has done over these last few decades with its defense sectors, as you mentioned, Megan, which is Turkey went from being almost 100% dependent on imports of
Hmm.
defense technologies to being almost totally self-sufficient now. So, in
Hmm.
that same general spirit of becoming self-sufficient on defense issues,
Hmm.
the Trump administration would like to see at the NATO summit Europe taking on more responsibility. And I was just at a conference of the institute in Estonia that I used to be the director of, that you mentioned in the introduction, over the weekend. And the German general who's in charge of NATO joint military operations,
Hmm.
and also the chief of the German army, a different general, just yesterday, both said NATO needs to
Hmm.
be ready for a Russian military attack on NATO territory by 2029. Because if you look at the capabilities and the deployments that Russia is preparing,
Hmm.
even as it fails to win the war in Ukraine and is in fact losing that war,
Hmm.
all of those preparations, or many of those preparations, point to Russia preparing to attack NATO territory, and
Hmm.
in the Baltic states, and
Yeah.
maybe in Poland.
I
So,
say probably in Estonia too. So,
yep,
I mean,
yeah,
that is the most likely target somewhere in the Baltics. So
yeah.
it's good that, sort of Central European allies are starting to sort of wake up to this phenomenon. So,
They are all across the alliance, and
yeah.
defense ministers all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands for the last couple of
Mhm.
years have been saying the same thing.
Mhm.
NATO's preparing for an attack. Now, I don't think NATO is preparing for all-out war like
Mhm.
it's waging against Ukraine. I think what Russia is trying to do is win a glorious victory, political victory for President Putin by destroying NATO. And
Mhm.
what that means is, I think the plan would be to launch an ambiguous military operation, like initially in Crimea, where Russian soldiers, not in uniform,
Mhm.
not with any Russian insignia, occupy some territory. Let's say, yeah, Eastern
Mhm.
Estonia or Latvia, maybe not very important territory, but they're there nonetheless.
Mhm.
And then President Putin says, "Oh, they are Russian troops.
Mhm.
Are you, NATO, going to come and attack them and risk nuclear war, World War III, just for
Mhm.
this unimportant territory? Yeah, we came into this region because we faced a real, genuine threat, whatever it is. He'll make something up." And I think there's a very good chance that several members of the NATO alliance would not vote yes, or would not want to vote yes to go to war with Russia. And if they failed to, and
Mhm.
if Article 5 was invoked by one of those Eastern member states of NATO, and NATO didn't come to the rescue, that's effectively the end of Article
Mhm.
5, and therefore the end of NATO as the world's most successful political military alliance in history, in terms of
Mhm.
deferring a big enemy. That would be a huge political rather than military victory for
Mhm.
President Putin, but it wouldn't involve an all-out war with NATO. That's a terrifying scenario, and therefore, as you said, it's really good that all NATO, well, or as many leaders of NATO member state countries as possible, are saying, we see Russia preparing to attack. We will be ready. We have the will to fight back, so that Russia doesn't even try to attack NATO territory.
Yeah, sure.
And Turkey's absolutely key to all of this, with its
Mhm.
capabilities and its resolve to protect NATO territory.
Yeah, sure. And especially, I mean, it's the second largest army in Turkey. So, and a country that's often looked to because of its large army for additional troop deployments. I mean, it would definitely
Yeah.
affect Turkey for sure. So,
Hmm.
okay. So I guess we'll move on since we're nearing the half hour mark to our
Sure.
final question, sort of the question that I'm asking everyone in this podcast series, the $1 million question.
Mm.
Do you have any predictions for the upcoming Ankara summit? And especially specifically to you, do you think that any of these predictions that you can foresee would impact the U.S.-Turkish relationship?
Well, I think, this is the second time there's been in the last 22 years. Yeah, there's been
Hmm.
a NATO summit in Turkey, and Turkey has really grown in terms of strategic importance on
Hmm.
the world stage, and it will have an impact in shaping the agenda. We don't know what the agenda is yet, or it hasn't been released yet. But for sure, what we already talked about will be on there.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Increasing defense spending and improving capabilities to deter Russia. But I think as the host and as such a strategically even more important country, Turkey, of course, is going to shape that agenda. And so, of course, Russia's war on Ukraine is a big part of it. And I think Turkey will probably encourage, and the NATO alliance will think through how to continue supporting Ukraine with the European allies
Hmm.
carrying the lion's share of the
Yeah.
burden and the responsibility, but also maintaining communications and facilitating the U.S. mediation between Ukraine and Russia. I chose that word carefully. It's not any longer U.S. support for Ukraine. The U.S.
Hmm.
views itself now as a mediator, I think, more than as a supporter of Ukraine.
Hmm.
But to the South will be very important. I think there'll be a discussion of how do NATO allies work together with regard to the Gaza conflict,
Hmm.
and managing relations with Israel. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz will be a big issue. President Trump has complained that NATO allies have not done more
Hmm.
to force the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. NATO allies have, I think, largely said, like the Chancellor of Germany, well, as he said in private, but it became public, that
Hmm.
Iran has humiliated the United States in the Strait of Hormuz. And, the NATO allies complain that the U.S. launched the war without consulting NATO allies and now expects NATO to come to the rescue. But then President Trump has come out and said, no, we don't need NATO allies to help keep the Strait of Hormuz open once it reopens. Of course, NATO allies are needed. And of course, Turkey worries very much about that. And of course, I think Turkey would like to see NATO playing some role, but that all has to be worked out. And, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Grinkiewicz, it's always an American, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, announced just in recent days, he said, essentially what I just said. Look, people are talking about what NATO could do in the Strait of Hormuz, but there's no planning yet at all because there's been no political decision taken by
Hmm.
NATO. So I think we would see some sort of a decision on that.
Hmm.
There are all sorts of technical issues that are always on the agenda in terms of transforming NATO's fighting capabilities, not just buying more stuff, but developing new capabilities. I think there'll be a real focus on European members of NATO developing capabilities that they've relied largely on the United States to provide in the last few
Hmm.
decades. So those are capabilities that involve stuff in the sky and in the air. So
Hmm.
airlift, satellites, and sensors. So intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance sensors, which allow countries in the NATO alliance to identify a potential threat and
Hmm.
then to target that threat and then neutralize that threat. So those sensors, great ones of which are, by the way, produced here in Turkey. There's a company called Esen, which is owned by
Hmm.
the big U.S. Aerospace company Sierra Nevada. Those systems can be mounted on satellites or on aircraft or even be stationary. So, and then there's air defense that we've already talked about. That's so important to Turkey, especially air defense along NATO's southern flank, and the whole issue of NATO's southern flank. I think will be discussed also at the Ankara summit. So capabilities, both volume of new capabilities,
Hmm.
replacing U.S. capabilities that might be withdrawn. So in the sky, in the air, and air defense, and then NATO's southern flank, extended southern flank, so looking toward Israel, Gaza, and the Strait of Hormuz. I think all of those will be top agenda items at the Ankara summit.
Okay. Okay, great. So a little bit of business as usual, a little bit of responding to the political situation today. So,
Always,
kind of sounds like your normal summit when you phrase it that way, but of
of
course we'll
course.
have to wait and see what
Yeah,
happens in
yeah. I mean,
Ankara.
the
So,
host, yeah, the host of a NATO summit can have a bit more influence, but it's
mhm.
NATO. It's a
Yeah.
huge organization of very
Mhm.
powerful countries, and yeah, they've definitely have lots of business that needs to be transacted since the last NATO summit.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, we'll wrap up there. Thank you, Ambassador Bryza, for joining us today for the NATO and Turkey podcast. Again, I'm Megan Gisclon, and you've been listening to Istanbul Policy Center's NATO and Turkey podcast. We'll be back the week after next, after the Bayram holiday, with another episode. So make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or join our mailing list to be notified about new episodes. Thank you again for joining us, and have a nice day.
Thanks, Megan. İyi bayramlar.
Thank you. İyi bayramlar to you too.